3:47 a.m. 6 men in the water. Zero margin for error. 40 minutes later, Crimea's last intact land route would be cut in half. This is SteelFront. I'm your host, and we cover the battles that change wars. Tonight, the story of the Chonhar Causeway, the narrow strip of asphalt and rail that Russian planners assumed was untouchable. They were wrong, and the men who proved it wrong never fired a single shot. By the time this operation wrapped up, Crimea's already strained logistics network lost its second-to-last working artery. Fuel rationing that had already spread as far as Siberia tightened further. And Russian engineers who'd spent 2 years reinforcing bridges against missiles and drones found out they'd been guarding against the wrong threat the whole time. Stick around, because what happens in the water tonight changes how militaries think about coastal defense. Let's set the scene. June 2026. For 18 months, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign had been quietly strangling occupied Crimea. The Kerch Strait Bridge, struck, repaired, struck again, now running at a fraction of its original capacity. The rail lines feeding fuel depots near Jazonkoy, hit repeatedly by Storm Shadow missiles and domestically produced long-range drones. Naval drone packs had already pushed what remained of the Black Sea Fleet into hiding, forcing Russian warships to relocate from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk just to survive. Satellite imagery confirmed fuel queues stretching for kilometers outside Simferopol gas stations by early spring. Russian sources, tracked through open channels, even reported fuel rationing as far as Siberian military districts, which gives you a sense of how far the squeeze on Crimea was rippling backward through the supply chain. But one route remained, the Chonhar Causeway, a narrow land bridge linking the Kherson region to northern Crimea, carrying both a 2-lane highway and a single rail track across the shallow waters of the Syvash, sometimes called the Rotten Sea. Russian military planners treated it as their fallback, the route meant to keep functioning, even if everything else failed. Air defense batteries ringed the approaches. Patrol boats swept the open water on a rotating schedule. Engineers had reinforced the causeway's support structure twice since 2023, specifically against missile strikes and drone attacks. On paper, Chonhar looked airtight. In practice, it collapsed in under an hour. Here's what nobody expected. Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, had been quietly studying Chonhar for months, not as a missile target, but as a target for men in wetsuits. I went through hours of open-source military analysis on this operation, and one detail kept nagging at me. Every Russian defensive measure at Chonhar was built to stop something flying or floating on the surface. Radar coverage, air defense radii, patrol boat sweep patterns, all of it assumed the threat would come from above the waterline. Nobody built defenses against 6 men swimming below it. The unit assigned to this mission came from GUR's Maritime Special Operations Element, the same lineage of combat swimmers behind earlier sabotage strikes against Russian infrastructure in occupied territory. These aren't men who train for parade ground reviews. Years of cold water dive training, demolition certification, infiltration under live patrol conditions. Each operator carries roughly 30 kilograms of equipment into the water. Rebreather apparatus to keep surface bubbles down, waterproof explosive charges, detonation timers, and a dive knife as the only backup if things go badly wrong. Planning alone took close to 4 months. GUR analysts cross-referenced satellite passes, patrol boat refueling schedules, and the tidal patterns of the Syvash, a body of water so shallow and saline that standard diving doctrine barely applies. It averages less than 1 meter deep across much of its surface, which made conventional scuba approaches useless. Instead, operators trained in a hybrid technique, partial submersion, slow lateral movement through mud and reed cover, surfacing only when masked by darkness and weather. Which weapon was deadlier in this campaign? Precision missiles, naval drones, or special forces sabotage? Comment your answer below, because tonight's operation makes the case for option 3. The first complication came early. Reconnaissance teams had identified a 3-week weather window, with moon illumination staying below 10%, ideal for an undetected approach. But 2 weeks before the planned infiltration date, a Russian patrol boat rotation changed without warning, adding an extra night sweep directly across the planned approach corridor. The whole plan needed last-minute revision. GUR planners shifted the infiltration point nearly 400 meters east, into a stretch of water previously dismissed as too shallow for cover. It turned out to be the right call. The new approach put the swim team directly beneath a blind spot in the patrol boat's radar arc, a gap nobody on the Russian side had mapped because they figured no one could move through water that shallow undetected. By late May, the team was ready. Final mission approval came down through GUR command. Time to coincide with a forecasted low-pressure system that would keep cloud cover thick and visibility poor across the Syvash through the night of the operation. 3 a.m. The insertion team moved out from a staging point on the Kherson-controlled side of the Syvash, using a low-profile, rigid inflatable boat running on electric motors to keep acoustic signature down. Engine noise reduced to almost nothing. No running lights. The boat covered the first 2 kilometers in near silence, before cutting power entirely, drifting the final approach on current alone. 3:31 a.m. The 6-man team entered the water roughly 600 meters from the causeway's support structure. Water temperature, cold enough to demand thermal protection even in early summer. Visibility underwater, less than half a meter in the silty saline mix of the Syvash, which worked in the team's favor by masking movement from any chance visual detection, but also meant operators had to navigate largely by compass bearing and memorize terrain rather than sight. Put yourself in their position for a second. 600 meters of cold, near-zero visibility water, every minute spent within range of patrol boats armed with searchlights and, if discovered, machine guns. No extraction guaranteed if something goes wrong. No backup arriving in time if a patrol boat catches a silhouette in the dark. 3:47 a.m. The team reached the causeway's support pylons. This was the moment of maximum exposure. Operators had to surface partially to work, breaking the underwater concealment that had carried them this far. Each charge needed to go against specific structural points identified months earlier through engineering analysis, load-bearing junctions where damage would cause the most disruption for the least explosive mass. Since hauling large quantities of demolition material through 600 meters of open water was never realistic, the team finished placing charges before the patrol pattern fully closed back in. What they didn't know yet was that a routine patrol boat, running early because of a shift change miscommunication, was already approaching from the south, nearly 20 minutes ahead of its expected sweep time. 4:02 a.m. Charges placed. Detonation timers set for a synchronized window roughly 90 minutes out. Time to go off after the team had cleared the danger zone and well before dawn light could expose the damage to casual observation, giving them maximum time to extract. The team began the swim back, now fighting fatigue and a rising current as the tide shifted. Here's the part that nearly ended the mission. As the early patrol boat's searchlights swept across the water, roughly 200 meters from the team's position, one operator's equipment bag snagged on submerged debris, wreckage from an earlier strike elsewhere on the causeway that had never been cleared. For nearly 90 seconds, the operator was effectively pinned, couldn't surface for air without exposing the team's position, couldn't free the gear without risking noise. The team leader made the call to cut the bag loose, sacrificing some of the recovered equipment to keep the operator moving. The searchlight passed without finding them. The patrol boat kept sweeping, unaware it had come within 200 meters of one of the more consequential sabotage operations in the Chonhar sector. 4:51 a.m. All 6 operators reached the extraction point. The inflatable boat, which had been holding position under cover roughly a kilometer away, moved in to pick them up. By 5:15 a.m., the unit was back on Ukrainian-controlled territory. Equipment recovered, everyone accounted for. 0 casualties on the GUR team. The position held, and more to the point, the enemy never even knew about it until it was too late to matter. What's most surprising about this case isn't the explosives or the engineering. It's the patience. 4 months of planning for roughly 90 minutes of underwater work. That ratio tells you a lot about how modern special operations actually function. It isn't dramatic action sequences. It's repetition, rehearsal, and waiting for the one night the variables line up. 5:32 a.m. The synchronized charges detonated. Witnesses in the area, confirmed later through Russian telegram channels reporting on the incident, described a series of underwater concussions followed by visible structural sagging along a roughly 30-meter span of the causeway's support section. The rail line embedded there twisted out of alignment within minutes. The roadway surface above cracked and partially sank, making the affected lane impassable to heavy vehicle traffic almost immediately. Subscribe to SteelFront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what you're watching right now is a masterclass in asymmetric engineering sabotage. By sunrise, Russian engineering units arriving to assess the damage found a structure that, by all conventional defensive logic, should never have been vulnerable. Air defense radars had recorded nothing. Patrol boats had detected nothing. No missile contrail, no drone signature, no radar return of any kind in the hours before the structure failed. For a Russian command structure that had spent 2 years building defensive doctrine around aerial and surface threats, an attack from beneath the waterline was a kind of failure nobody had prepared for. Most people assume a heavily defended choke point like Chonhar, with air defense coverage, patrol boats, and constant surveillance, would be effectively immune to sabotage. The evidence says otherwise. Defenses built around one threat model leave gaps for every other threat model nobody bothered to consider. That's not unique to Russia. It's a general lesson in military engineering, and one reason this operation deserves more attention than it's gotten. The timing made the damage worse than the raw numbers suggest. Chonhar wasn't just any route. It was the fallback, the one Russian logistics planners had been quietly relying on if the Kerch Strait Bridge ever became fully unusable. With Kerch already running well below capacity from prior strikes, and now Chonhar partially severed, occupied Crimea's overland supply options had narrowed to a single, heavily congested corridor. This is worth sitting with for a moment. It wasn't a single dramatic strike meant to make headlines. It was one more turn of a slow, methodical squeeze that's been running for over a year. Drone strikes on refineries, missile strikes on rail junctions, naval drones pushing the fleet into hiding, and now special forces cutting the routes that survived everything else. Crimea isn't being conquered in the conventional sense. It's being isolated, piece by piece, until both the garrison and the civilian population depend on a logistics network that gets thinner every month. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback in the comments. Russian command's decision to treat Chonhar as a fallback rather than a primary defensive priority was its own kind of negligence, reinforcing a bridge against missiles while leaving its underwater support structure essentially unguarded against divers isn't bad luck. It's a planning failure, and it cost Russian logistics planners a route they'll now have to live without for weeks, possibly longer, depending on repair capacity in a region already short on materials and labor. How many vehicles did this single sabotage operation effectively take out of Russian logistics rotation for the affected window? A, 0, since no vehicles were destroyed directly. B, roughly 40 heavy transport vehicles forced to reroute daily. C, over 100 vehicles per day redirected through the Kerch corridor. Hold that thought. The answer comes at the end, and it's not the obvious one. If you think special operations win wars as effectively as missiles and drones do, type SteelFront in the comments, because tonight's story is Exhibit 1 in that argument. The 4-hour gap between detonation and the first confirmed Russian damage assessment tells its own story. Intercepted communications, monitored through open Russian military channels, reportedly showed confusion at the local engineering command level. Initial reports misidentified the cause as a possible leftover explosive device from earlier fighting, rather than deliberate sabotage. It took roughly 6 hours for Russian assessments to settle on the correct explanation. A coordinated attack against the causeway's foundation, carried out by personnel who entered and left without ever being detected. Russian engineering units found the rail line unusable outright, and the road surface reduced to single-lane, weight-restricted passage, meaning heavy transport vehicles, the trucks actually carrying fuel and ammunition, couldn't cross at all. Lighter vehicles funneled through at reduced speed under close engineering supervision, creating immediate bottlenecks that satellite imagery later confirmed as queues, stretching well over a kilometer on the Kherson region approach within the first 24 hours. There's a detail in this story that stuck with me more than the explosives. The team that planted these charges didn't just disable a structure, they dented Russian confidence in every other piece of infrastructure across the peninsula. If Chonhar could be reached, what else could be? Crimean bridge support pylons, port facilities at Sevastopol and Feodosia, pipeline crossings. Every structure with a foundation in water is now a potential vulnerability that Russian engineers have to account for, and accounting for it eats resources, manpower, and time that aren't available for anything else. You'd think that after 18 months of escalating Ukrainian strikes against Crimean infrastructure, Russian command would have anticipated an underwater threat eventually. It didn't. The thing is, this wasn't supposed to work. Underwater sabotage against a defended military target, pulled off without detection, without casualties, and without any electronic signature for radar or surveillance to catch, is exactly the kind of operation that fails in training exercises half the time, because of current, visibility, or timing errors. And yet, on the night that mattered, it went exactly as planned. What would you have done at 3:47 in the morning, 600 meters into cold open water, with a patrol boat closing in, and your equipment caught on debris you couldn't see? That's worth sitting with, because it's the difference between an operation that gets written about and one that gets buried with its team. By the time the sun was fully up over the Syvash, the strategic picture for Russian logistics planners had gotten measurably worse. With Chonhar reduced to single-lane restricted traffic and weeks of repair ahead, repair work made slower by the fact that the Syvash's saline shallow water makes underwater structural work equipment intensive, even without active combat. The Kerch Strait Bridge corridor became the only meaningfully functional overland route into occupied Crimea. Every truck, every fuel convoy, every ammunition transfer that previously had two viable paths now competed for capacity on one causeway down, but the bigger story was only beginning. What Russian planners didn't fully grasp in the first 72 hours was that GUR's reconnaissance teams were already documenting the resulting traffic patterns at the Kerch corridor, patterns that would directly shape targeting priorities for the next phase of the broader campaign. Within days, satellite imagery showed measurable secondary effects rippling through the occupied peninsula's fuel network. Gas station queues in Simferopol, already a familiar sight through the spring, grew visibly longer. Local Russian-installed administration officials, in statements picked up by open-source monitors, downplayed the disruption publicly, while internal logistics communications, intercepted and analyzed by Ukrainian intelligence, painted a far more strained picture, describing fuel allocation being shifted toward military units at the expense of civilian distribution in several districts. This is the part of the story that doesn't always make headlines but matters for understanding how siege warfare functions now. Crimea isn't being starved through one dramatic blow. It's being starved through dozens of operations like this one, each individually survivable, each compounding into a logistics crisis Russian command can't fully solve without either reopening supply lines that no longer exist or accepting permanently reduced capacity across the whole peninsula. Russian forces, supplied throughout this campaign with North Korean artillery ammunition shipped through sanctions evasion routes and reliant on Iranian-derived Shahed drone technology for their own strikes, ended up unable to adequately defend domestic infrastructure against the very kind of asymmetric warfare their own forces had spent years using against Ukrainian cities. The contrast matters. Where Russian Shahed and missile strikes have repeatedly hit Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power grids, residential buildings, hospitals, this GUR operation targeted exclusively military logistics infrastructure, a distinction that holds up under scrutiny in a way Russian strikes consistently don't. Was severing Chonhar through underwater sabotage the smarter tactical move, compared to, say, a more dramatic strike against the Kerch Bridge itself? Run the math. Chonhar required no missiles, risked no aircraft, exposed Ukraine to zero diplomatic fallout over Western-supplied weapons being used in a strike, and achieved a meaningful logistics effect for a fraction of the cost of a single guided missile. Real tactics, real consequences. SteelFront. In the weeks that followed, GUR's broader maritime sabotage doctrine, first proven through earlier operations against Russian naval assets in the Black Sea, found a new use against static infrastructure. Open-source defense analysts describe this as a shift in Ukrainian asymmetric strategy. Rather than relying solely on long-range strike systems vulnerable to air defense and increasingly costly to sustain at scale, Ukraine had shown a repeatable, low-cost method for degrading critical infrastructure that conventional Russian air defense simply can't intercept. We went through months of open-source reporting on Crimea's infrastructure status. And here's what doesn't make the news cycle the way a missile strike does: slow, patient degradation. The peninsula's overland connectivity to mainland Russia is now down to a single corridor running at restricted capacity, supplemented by ferry operations that remain vulnerable to naval drone interdiction. Every week that passes without a permanent fix adds further strain on a garrison and civilian population already managing fuel rationing, restricted movement, and uncertainty about whether the next strike hits something they depend on directly. 20 minutes before the planning phase had originally been finalized, GUR command nearly pushed the mission back. An entire month after updated satellite imagery showed a new patrol boat added to the rotation. The same complication that ultimately reshaped the approach corridor, rather than scrapping the mission. It's worth noting how close this operation came to not happening at all, and how a single adjustment in approach geometry made the difference between failure and one of the more consequential infrastructure strikes of the campaign. Subscribe to SteelFront, because preparation beats improvisation, and this operation proves it. What would NATO planners have done differently watching an operation like this unfold? Comment your analysis, because the lessons here go well beyond this one bridge, into questions about how any nation defends critical infrastructure against threats coming from beneath the surface rather than above it. By early June, Ukrainian General Staff assessments, backed by independent satellite analysts, tracking vehicle queues at both Chonhar and Kerch, estimated the operation had forced dozens of heavy logistics vehicles a day to reroute through the already strained Kerch corridor, adding to wait times that in some documented cases stretched past 12 hours for fuel tankers trying to cross into the peninsula. Ukrainian sources put the cumulative delay over the following month at a measurable reduction in overall fuel and ammunition throughput, reaching Crimean garrisons. The numbers are hard to verify precisely, given how closed Russian military logistics reporting is, but they line up with the broader pattern of fuel scarcity tracked through the spring. Here's the second layer worth pausing on. The Chonhar operation didn't happen in isolation. It was timed deliberately to compound an already developing crisis, hitting at the moment Crimean fuel reserves were at their most strained point of the year. That's not coincidence. That's operational sequencing, the kind of patient, multi-domain coordination between drone strikes, missile interdiction, and special forces sabotage that's defined this isolation campaign from the start. Every piece reinforces every other piece. By mid-June, repair crews dispatched to Chonhar ran into their own obstacles. Specialized underwater construction equipment, built for the Syvash's shallow, saline conditions, turned out to be in short supply across occupied Crimea, with some of it reportedly trucked in from mainland Russia at considerable logistical cost, further straining the very transport capacity the bridge was supposed to relieve. Engineering assessments that leaked through open-source channels pointed to a repair timeline measured in months, not weeks, complicated further by the ongoing risk of another Ukrainian strike against the structure or its repair crews. The strangest part? Through the repair effort, Russian forces sharply increased patrol density around Chonhar. More boats, more personnel, even reported additional underwater sonar monitoring. A reactive defense, built only after the vulnerability had already been exploited. It's a pattern repeated across this entire campaign. Russian defensive measures consistently arrive one operation behind the threat that actually materializes, reinforcing the previous attack vector instead of anticipating the next one. We cut several technical details about charge placement and the timing sequence from this video for length and operational sensitivity. Comment more if you'd want a deeper breakdown of underwater demolition tactics in a future video. GUR's documentation team had already begun compiling the operation into what would become a template for future infrastructure operations elsewhere along the peninsula's perimeter. What looked, in the immediate aftermath, like a single successful sabotage mission, turned out to be the opening move in a sustained campaign against every remaining piece of Crimean overland connectivity. So let's go back to the quiz from earlier. How many vehicles did this operation effectively force out of normal rotation? The answer is B. Roughly 40 heavy transport vehicles a day, forced to reroute through the Kerch corridor in the weeks immediately following the strike, based on satellite-confirmed traffic pattern analysis. Not the dramatic 100-plus figure some might guess. And not zero either. The real number tells the more accurate story. Modern infrastructure warfare doesn't need to destroy everything to be devastating. It just needs to remove enough capacity to push an already strained system past its breaking point. Here's the lasting tactical lesson. Static, heavily defended infrastructure built to survive the threats you expect remains badly vulnerable to the threats you don't. Air defense, patrol boats, and surveillance radar all assume an approach from above or across the water's surface. None of it accounts for a small team of trained operators moving below it. That blind spot, present at Chonhar and likely present at dozens of other Russian-defended structures across Crimea and beyond, is one of the more significant doctrinal vulnerabilities exposed during this phase of the war. Anyone defending coastal or riverine infrastructure now has to account for underwater approach vectors as seriously as aerial ones. That's the lesson this operation forces on military planners well beyond this conflict. Was severing Chonhar through underwater sabotage the right call, compared to a missile strike that might have destroyed the structure outright? Could Russian command have prevented this by extending underwater sonar monitoring to secondary crossings months earlier, instead of concentrating resources on the more visible Kerch Bridge? And what would you have done differently, sitting in a Russian engineering command post at sunrise, staring at a structure with no missile damage, no drone wreckage, and no explanation for why it had simply failed overnight? Subscribe to SteelFront. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. And the Chonhar operation belongs in that category, not because of scale, but because of precision, patience, and a vulnerability nobody on the defending side ever thought to guard against. The Syvash is quiet now. The patrol boats still sweep the water every night, searchlights tracing patterns across the shallow saline surface. But they're searching for something that's already happened, and may already be happening again, somewhere else along the same coastline. The causeway sits half-repaired, single-lane traffic, crawling across a structure that once carried the confidence of an entire logistics network. What's left isn't wrecked vehicles or aircraft this time. It's an assumption that a defended structure is a safe one. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy, and Chonhar is proof that sometimes the mistake isn't what you failed to build, it's what you failed to imagine. Stay vigilant.